The first accounts surfaced in the late summer of 1914, whispered among naval divers who had grown accustomed to the muted stillness of the Atlantic depths, yet were unprepared for the gaze that awaited them beneath the steel hull of a drifting supply vessel. They descended expecting only the routine inspection of a damaged keel, nothing more than rusting metal and the pale pulse of bioluminescent plankton drifting in suspension. But the quiet that greeted them that morning had a pressure of its own, a tightening of the water that felt almost deliberate, as though the ocean itself were holding its breath. The divers later confessed that even before their lamps cut through the darkness, they sensed something vast moving just beyond the limits of perception. It was not the cold that raised the hair on their arms inside the rubber of their suits. It was the conviction that they were no longer alone. Their descent was slow, careful, methodical, yet every meter made the darkness feel heavier. The water seemed to swallow sound, swallowing their thoughts with it. Their tether lines trailed behind like frail threads, inadequate anchors to the world above. One diver, Hargreave, later described how he felt as though he were sliding between the ribs of some ancient corpse, the Atlantic transformed into a hollow body whose marrow had long since seeped into the trenches. Another Boyden recalled seeing flickers at the edge of his lamp beam, as though scales the size of shingles shifted under layers of silt. He kept this to himself then, afraid to break the fragile calm that held their minds together. What they were inspecting was simple damage to the vessel's hull, claw-like gouges that Naval Command would later attribute to floating debris or unseen ice. But the divers already suspected otherwise. The marks curved in unnatural arcs, too intentional, too symmetrical, too purposeful to belong to anything mindless. They glided their hands over the metal, feeling the deep grooves that seemed to pulse with the memory of whatever force had carved them. The water grew warmer the closer they drifted toward the shadow beneath the keel. Hargreave's breathing quickened, fogging the inside of his mask. Boyden steadied him with a gloved hand, but the gesture did little to calm either man. For a moment, a dim vibration tremored through the water, subtle, yet unmistakable, like a heartbeat resonating through flesh rather than tide. Their lamps flickered. Both men froze. Something shifted behind them, an immense displacement of water that moved with intention. They turned slowly, their lights cutting shaky arcs through the darkness, and there, beyond the reach of certainty, an iridescent curve glinted faintly like wet stone. They drifted closer, thinking it might be part of the ship, or perhaps a pocket of trapped air reflecting their lamps. But as the shape sharpened, their minds refused to accept what their eyes insisted on revealing. It was an eyelid, closed, colossal. The lid alone was larger than a lifeboat, textured with ancient ridges that ran like tectonic fault lines across its surface. Their lights trembled over it, illuminating patterns that looked almost carved, as though nature had borrowed a sculptor's hand to shape something meant to be revered or feared. Then, as though disturbed by their presence, the eyelid shuddered. A low groan vibrated through the water, and the world seemed to tilt. Hargreave reached for the tether line, but his hand hovered uselessly in the water, transfixed by the impossibility before him. The eye opened. A disk of abyssal black surrounded an iris the color of storm-lit steel, shimmering like currents, colliding in a tempest. It dilated slowly, studying them with an intelligence that was neither animal nor anything their world had prepared them to understand. They could not move. They could not think. The gaze held them like a gravity, pulling at something deep within their minds, as though it were peeling back the layers of their memory, seeking familiarity in creatures far too small to matter. and yet they did matter. The divers felt it. Whatever this being was, it was aware of them not as prey, nor as threat, but as witnesses, and being witnessed by something so ancient felt like being unmade. Before I continue, I want to know something from you, drifting here with us in the dark of this story. Where are you watching this from tonight? The depths reach farther when we descend together. The creature's pupil narrowed, and for a fleeting moment the water warmed again, almost gently, almost curiously, as though the massive presence were brushing against their minds, testing their fear, tasting it. Boyden later tried to describe the sensation, saying it was like remembering a nightmare he had never dreamed. The eye blinked once, sending a ripple through the sea that nearly tore their regulators from their mouths. The hull above groaned under the pressure. Their tether lines jerked violently as the deck crew, sensing distress, pulled hard to retrieve them. But even as they ascended, the eye followed, unhurried, patient, a watcher beneath centuries of tide and myth, unveiling itself only long enough to remind humanity of what still sleeps below the mapped world. As their helmets broke the surface and the daylight seared their eyes, the divers clung to the edges of the retrieval net in trembling silence. No words could contain what they had seen, but the ocean, rolling gently around the hull, seemed to guard the secret with a slow, deliberate calm, as though warning them that some truths were never meant to rise. And yet stories do rise. They always rise. If the shadows of the deep are drawing you in, let them. Let this descent continue by joining us, subscribing so you never lose the trail of what waits beneath the waves. The official report filed by the Royal Navy described the incident as a case of collective hallucination caused by nitrogen narcosis, a convenient explanation meant to preserve order during a time when the world was already tearing itself apart in war. Europe burned while the ocean kept its own silence, swallowing evidence with the indifference of eternity. Yet among the divers who had seen the eye, silence became a punishment. Hargreave, withdrawn and haunted, resigned within the month, retreating to a small coastal village in Cornwall, where the wind never stopped moaning across the cliffs. Boyden remained in service longer, though the others said he would sometimes wake screaming in the night, clutching his chest as though drowning on dry land. None dared to speak publicly. The war consumed attention, and beneath that smoke and blood, the Atlantic kept its secrets. But the ocean has ways of remembering those who have touched its depths. Over the years that followed, scattered accounts emerged, fragments of letters, pages torn from journals, reports buried within naval archives, stamped classified beyond release. Fishermen described currents that turned warm without reason, sonar readings that failed in certain coordinates, and eerie silences where sea life vanished entirely. The same coordinates appeared again and again, tracing an invisible circle between the British Isles and the mid-Atlantic ridge, a place where compasses trembled and depth gauges spun erratically, as if refusing to measure what lay below. In 1923, a Norwegian whaling ship, the Hjordis, drifted off course during a violent storm and reported striking something enormous beneath the waves. When the weather cleared, the crew discovered that one of their harpoons had impaled a fragment of something like flesh, yet not flesh at all. It was dark and fibrous, like volcanic rock interlaced with veins that pulsed faintly under light. Scientists who examined the piece described it as biological but unclassifiable. Within weeks, the fragment decayed into a black residue that hardened like stone. The report never reached publication, its pages quietly locked away by maritime authorities. The captain of the Yardies, before vanishing at sea a year later, was said to have confessed to a priest that he had seen an eye beneath the water that night, and that it looked back at him with recognition. The pattern was unmistakable to those who dared to connect the dots. Divers, sailors, and researchers who encountered anomalies in that sector often suffered identical afflictions: insomnia, paranoia, and the recurring vision of a colossal eye watching from the deep. Some ended their own lives, convinced they had glimpsed not an animal, but a god. Others described dreams filled with strange hymns that seemed to echo from the bottom of the sea, in a language that vibrated rather than spoke. Those who listened too long developed bleeding ears, or claimed to feel drawn towards the water, unable to resist its pull. The few who survived long enough to recount their nightmares often disappeared soon after, as though claimed by the same intelligence that had marked them below. Records from a British naval researcher named Dr. Edmund Varley, declassified decades later, offered the first academic acknowledgement that something vast, biological, and sentient might inhabit the Atlantic depths. His notes mention a presence beneath the continental slope, a pressure anomaly consistent with a mass several kilometers in diameter. Varley speculated that the being, if alive, had survived since before the breakup of Pangaea, feeding not on life, but on motion, sound, or thought itself. His final entry read simply, "The eye does not watch to hunt. It watches to remember." He disappeared 2 weeks later while aboard a research vessel en route to the very coordinates he had studied. By 1930, the whispers among seafarers had become superstition. They refused to sail certain routes, calling the area the eye's domain. Maps from that period show a strange avoidance pattern, ships rerouting hundreds of miles to stay clear of a seemingly harmless patch of ocean. Insurance companies noticed but never questioned it. Governments knew more than they admitted. Unmarked vessels began appearing, black-painted without flags, and sonar interference became frequent near that same zone. Something was happening beneath the waves, something far older than any human wore. Some said it slept, others said it waited, and though no one dared to approach again, strange pulses began to echo through underwater cables in 1932, signals rhythmic and deliberate, resembling a heartbeat stretched across the planet's longest arteries. Telegraph operators dismissed them as static, but one engineer, a man named Willis Grant, decoded fragments of the pattern and realized with mounting terror that it was not random. It was communication, a sequence repeating every 9 hours, shaped like a call and response. One pulse to the depths, one echo back, as if something massive beneath the Atlantic were answering. That was when reports of strange lights began. Submerged illumination flickering hundreds of meters below, sometimes visible even from the decks of passing ships on moonless nights. Witnesses described the glow as pale and bluish, spreading in slow spirals, like an iris opening and closing beneath the surface. Those who saw it often fell ill afterward. Migraines, blurred vision, and the inexplicable sensation of being observed, even on land. Boyden, now aged and broken, saw the reports in a newspaper and felt the old weight pressing against his lungs. He wrote a final letter before vanishing himself, a letter later found sealed in a waterproof tin. The last line read, "It has not forgotten us, and neither did the sea." If you felt that chill down your spine, that pressure in the room when the ocean is mentioned, it isn't coincidence. The Atlantic remembers. Stay close, stay in the dark, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll be here when we descend deeper. By the time the Second World War ignited across the continents, the ocean had already claimed its own battlefield. Unseen, wordless, eternal, submarines began vanishing without distress calls, swallowed by silence rather than fire. The Admiralty blamed mechanical failure, yet the pattern was too precise. Entire crews lost contact within the same sector of the mid-Atlantic, the same coordinates traced by the divers in 1914. Wartime secrecy ensured these disappearances were buried under bureaucratic shadows, but those who worked sonar deep in the Atlantic trenches whispered of something vast moving beneath their vessels, something that reflected no ping, no return, as if the sea itself bent around its form. Among these classified records was the logbook of U-Boat 219, recovered decades later from German archives. Its final entries are fragmented, written in haste, the handwriting trembling as though carved by a hand shaking from more than fear. The captain describes a massive organic reflection following the submarine for several hours. The crew heard rhythmic sounds through the hull, not mechanical, not metallic, but biological, heartbeats. They grew louder with every passing hour, until the captain ordered the engines shut down. Then came the stillness. The entry ends abruptly with a final line, scrawled in ink that bled from water exposure. The eye is open again. After the war, the United States and Britain quietly initiated a joint research mission under the pretense of mapping undersea trenches. The real purpose was hidden: to locate the source of unexplained magnetic fluctuations and low-frequency sounds recorded from the mid-Atlantic ridge. The project's name was Operation Nereus. Most of its documentation has since vanished, but fragments of personal accounts survived, smuggled through letters and diaries. Among them was that of a technician named Ruth Morley, who described the ocean as breathing in cycles, as though the seafloor itself expanded and contracted with some unseen pulse. She noted sonar returns resembling the curvature of an immense sphere embedded in the seabed. Too symmetrical, too perfect to be natural. A shape that, when mapped, resembled the iris of an eye. Morley's last report mentioned vibrations strong enough to make the instruments hum. "The sea feels aware," she wrote, "as though the abyss itself is concentrating on us." The next day, her entire team vanished without radio contact. Their ship was later found adrift, equipment destroyed, hull undamaged. Only a single recording survived, its static interrupted by a low sound. A deep, continuous note that grew in pitch, trembling like breath rising from the lungs of a mountain. When the recording was analyzed years later, researchers discovered a disturbing anomaly. The waveform was not random. It matched the electrical pattern of a human heartbeat, amplified thousands of times. The sea began to change around that period. Strange die-offs of marine life appeared near the equatorial currents. Fishermen reported seeing massive whirlpools forming without wind, spiraling upward as though the ocean was exhaling. Satellite photography revealed faint circular discolorations in the Atlantic, enormous enough to span several kilometers. These rings, nearly invisible to the naked eye, pulsed with a regular rhythm. Scientists attributed it to volcanic activity, though no heat or seismic disturbance was detected. To those who remembered the stories, it was the pupil of something stirring beneath the waves. The few remaining witnesses from 1914 lived long enough to feel the pull of the sea return. Hargreave, now an old man, was found sitting on the shoreline one autumn evening, his gaze fixed toward the horizon. When asked what he was watching, he replied softly, "It's calling again." Hours later, he walked into the tide and never came back. The locals claimed the waves glowed faintly that night, a pale reflection that shimmered like an iris in the dark. Through the 1950s and 1960s, oceanic instruments continued to pick up irregular sonar anomalies, patterns too consistent to be geological. Every recorded pulse repeated at exact intervals of 9 hours, just like the wartime transmissions before them. Oceanographers who studied the data noticed an unnerving synchronicity. Each pulse coincided with a measurable rise in atmospheric pressure, as though the very air responded to something breathing beneath the sea. Governments denied correlation, though their silence spoke otherwise. In 1967, the first deep-sea submersible capable of reaching the mid-Atlantic trench, Bathy's vortex, descended to the depth from which the pulses originated. The mission's live transmission broadcast for 6 hours before abruptly cutting off. The final audible words, spoken by the lead pilot, were, "We're seeing light, movement, wait," followed by static and a distant thud, like a colossal heartbeat echoing through metal. The submersible was never recovered, but what followed was more unsettling. Within days, coastal monitors across the Atlantic registered an enormous displacement of water, as if the seafloor itself had shifted. Then, silence. For nearly 2 decades afterward, no further anomalies were recorded. The ocean went still, as if satisfied, as if it had fed. And yet in the 1980s, sonar operators on transatlantic cable-laying ships began reporting something impossible, signals rising upward from beneath the crust. Not sound, not seismic energy, but structured frequencies resembling encoded data. When the waveforms were translated into visual patterns, the resulting image was unmistakable. An eye, half closed, rendered in pale concentric lines. Whether myth, machine, or organism, no one could explain it. Some claimed it was the earth itself. Gaia, Leviathan, the old gods returning in the language of tides. Others whispered of something far older than creation, a witness to every extinction, patient and eternal. And still, it watches. You feel that too, don't you? The weight of its gaze, even through a screen, even across a century. The ocean doesn't forget those who dare to look back. If you're still here, if you can still hear the pulse beneath these words, don't look away. Subscribe now, and stay with us in the dark before it opens its eye again. By the dawn of the 21st century, the myth of the eye beneath the Atlantic had become an obscure maritime legend, whispered on late-night radio shows and shared among deep-sea explorers who refused to laugh when the sonar flickered. But as technology advanced and humanity mapped nearly every inch of the ocean floor, a strange truth emerged. There were still regions, particularly near the mid-Atlantic ridge, that defied scanning. Entire stretches of seabed produced corrupted data, as though the signal was being bent or reflected by something vast yet unseen. The official explanation cited magnetic interference caused by mineral deposits, but the engineers knew better. The interference had rhythm. It pulsed. It lived. In 2003, a multinational research project known as Deep Azure launched a series of autonomous drones to penetrate the uncharted trenches. Each was equipped with cameras, sensors, and encrypted transmitters. The first 4 drones reported nothing but darkness. The 5th, designated DA-05, sent back 12 seconds of footage before its transmission ceased. The video was grainy, almost incomprehensible, until enhanced by analysts. Beneath the blur of silt and motion, a single detail stood out. A curve, smooth and glistening, reflecting the light like wet obsidian. Then, movement. A dilation, vast and slow, swallowing the camera's reflection until only black remained. The footage never aired publicly, but copies leaked into the black corners of the internet. Those who watched the enhanced version claimed to see patterns inside the darkness. Spiraling symbols faintly glowing around the pupil, like writing older than human speech. Some described feeling sick afterward, as if their equilibrium had been disturbed. Others said they began dreaming of deep water and a sound like thunder beating inside their skulls. Authorities scrubbed the footage from every platform, but fragments remain, passed through encrypted drives like relics from a forgotten cult. The cult, however, was real, known as the Followers of the Depth. It surfaced around 2006, gathering in coastal ruins and abandoned naval stations. They claimed the being beneath the Atlantic was awakening, not to destroy, but to reclaim. They spoke of humanity as an infection upon an older world, a layer of consciousness spread over a living planet that had grown tired of being ignored. To them, the eye was not a monster. It was the planet's own memory resurfacing. Members disappeared frequently, often found drowned miles offshore, their eyes wide open and filled with salt crystals. Autopsies revealed something stranger. Microscopic metallic structures embedded in their retinas, arranged like fractal spirals. In 2011, a seismic event registered off the coast of the Azores. The readings were unlike any earthquake ever recorded. Rather than originating from below, the shockwave began in the water itself, a pulse that rose upward, propagating in a perfect circle. The wave struck sonar buoys across the Atlantic simultaneously, and for exactly 9 hours afterward, all underwater microphones detected a faint, steady thumping. When converted to sound, the frequency resembled a heartbeat, slowed to 1/16th human rhythm. The world's agencies ignored it. The news did not. But those who remembered the old diver's tale, those who had heard of the colossal eye, recognized it for what it was. The ocean had opened its gaze again. Around that same time, fishing vessels began reporting phenomena too specific to dismiss. Massive shadows passing beneath them, slow enough to be measured in minutes, not seconds. One trawler captain described a wall of lightless flesh stretching beneath the ship as far as the sonar could reach. Instruments failed, engines died, and when power returned, several crew members were missing. No splash, no scream, just gone. Survivors described hearing something like a whisper beneath the water, a vibration inside their skulls urging them to look down. None of them ever went to sea again. Then came the storm of 2014. An unexplainable weather system that formed in the middle of the Atlantic without precedent or warning. Satellites caught what looked like a circular pattern within the cyclone's core, not cloud, not vapor, an iris, rotating. When the storm dissipated, deep-sea monitors detected a temperature spike of 6 degrees across the region once known as the eye's domain. The sea had awakened, and for weeks afterward, fishermen found dead whales washing ashore with their eyes burned white, their skulls fractured from within as if something had looked directly into them. In the years that followed, strange lights began appearing off the coasts of Ireland, Brazil, and Morocco. Faint, synchronized pulses forming a triangle across the Atlantic. Submarine communication cables transmitted interference that matched the old signals from 1932, still in that 9-hour pattern. Some theorized it was the beginning of tectonic realignment. Others whispered of reawakening. Governments stayed silent. But the ones who listened, oceanographers, cryptographers, and the descendants of those who had first seen the eye began gathering the data. They found something impossible. The pulses were forming coordinates, moving coordinates, as if the eye itself were rising. Late in 2023, a private expedition led by marine biologist Dr. Aisling Ward descended into the sector. Her submersible transmitted a final message before vanishing into the dark. "We've reached the heartbeat. It's not below us anymore. It's all around." Then nothing. Weeks later, a sonar buoy near her last location recorded the largest displacement of water ever documented. For 6 minutes, the Atlantic rose by nearly half a meter, then fell still, perfectly calm. No wreckage was ever found, and now strange tremors ripple across the seabed again. Instruments register pressure patterns that resemble blinking, as though the entire ocean were opening and closing, an unseen eye. The phenomenon repeats every 9 hours, every single day. You can almost feel it, can't you? The faint pull of the tide, the whisper beneath the hum of your own heartbeat. That's not imagination, that's memory, the ocean's memory returning to you. If you've followed this far into the dark, if you've felt the deep stir inside you, don't turn away now. Like the old divers, you've seen what waits beneath. Like them, you've been marked. Subscribe, like, and comment where the sea can hear you. Let the eye know you're still watching back.